projects have gotten not just large, but complex.
There's tremendous complexity, tightness in the supply chains, there's capacity constraints in the marketplace, the technological complexity, and regulatory complexity, and permitting and safety and environmental assessments. You bundle all of that together, and I think you have a phenomenally challenging, governance and management issue for the project leadership team. They're all people in organizations who've been thrown together in a boat, very rarely by choice.
Yes.
And they sort of have to figure out how to row together, efficiently,
Yes.
And make this vision a reality.
Every project says one team. Very rarely does it actually show up as one team.
We shouldn't sort of disguise the idea or conflate the idea of one team with something that feels like a little bit mushy or a little bit soft or whatever. I think there is a hardness and a preciseness to it. Culture in a mega project environment, it can feel like a little bit abstract.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's sort of hard to really define. So the thing I like about behavior is it can be a little bit more precise, and it can speak to me and what do I need to do in my relationship with colleagues or my relationship with partners or with owners that will lead to a better outcome. Designing a process to surface those behaviors and get buy-in and alignment around those behaviors, I think is a sort of foundational element of a really strong, effective project. A lot of mega projects, they'll generally risk getting off to a pretty difficult start. It's very difficult to carve out time for this at the front end of a project. It's a phenomenally important investment to make that pays dividends 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road.
Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Leadership Build. My name is Casey Freeman, partner with JMW Consultants, been working on major capital programs for several decades, and happy to have my very first guest, John Williams, president of Bechtel Infrastructure for Northeast USA and Canada. I've had the pleasure of working with John on several major programs in the UK and in Canada, and thrilled to have John join us here to really talk about the human factors that impact project performance. So John, welcome, and maybe by way of introducing yourself, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what are the kind of projects and works that you do at Bechtel Infrastructure, as well as a little bit of your background.
Sure. Well, Casey, great to see you again, and great that you're launching this podcast. Really feel like there's a gap there, and you're just about to help to fill it, because I don't think a lot of people talk about this side of what it takes to deliver on a mega project. So, the interaction of people, the human element of it, that ultimately is the acid test of whether this works or not. So, look, I've been with Bechtel for 13 years. I joined as a mid-career hire, so that makes me a little bit unusual within the business. I'd had the first half of my career really working in government and other parts of the public sector in the UK. And I finished up working as a special advisor in two governments back in 2005 to 2009. Then I joined Bechtel in 2008, and I've had a fantastic career over the last decade and more. Really testing myself in a variety of different roles. Ultimately now, today, I work as a regional general manager in our business, so I manage the P&L for Bechtel in the region that you just talked about. But I've worked on projects, worked on the Elizabeth line, and I've had the pleasure of working with JMW on a couple of different projects. What we try to do as a business ultimately is fulfill customers' ambitions, their visions to create new infrastructure in cities, in communities that are underserved. And we do that in sort of two ways. One is as a contractor, we're out in the field, self-performing work. We are employing craft professionals, but also as a project management consultant, supporting owners to manage that environment. So two different types of roles that we play. And my personal responsibility is sort of focused on the two verticals of rail, transit, and aviation.
Great, great. Well, there's a couple of things you said there that kind of piqued my interest. So you referenced mega projects. So interesting enough, I think it seems like most projects now have become mega projects. Interesting enough, I think I've even heard recently giga projects, from Saudi Arabia and other places. And I think projects have gotten not just large, but complex. And you also referenced that you had a history not just in pure construction, but also in government. And my observation is that certainly these large infrastructure projects, but I suspect even more and more with the oil and gas and mining projects we're working on. Well, there's a level of complexity that's emerged, beyond just here's the scope, go execute, build a tunnel, lay some concrete, the civils, but increasing complexity in really managing stakeholders, the political environment, as well as, technology. These projects are no longer just heavy civils projects, they're also technology projects. So how have you and Bechtel really dealt with this kind of evolution of projects in scale and complexity?
Yeah, so look, everything you just touched on there is correct. And I think it's probably just worth pausing to reflect on what we ask of people and organizations that come together to embark on a mission to make good a vision that's probably been in gestation for several years before anybody turns up, and probably decades in the case
Yes.
of some of these mega projects that we're involved in. And ultimately that's what being in a mega project is all about. It's a sort of fulfillment of a dream that is going to make a community or a city or sometimes even a country, function and prosper better. I'm always fascinated by the fact that, and I think it is an underserved sort of part of the conversation and the analysis that we do, that the people and the organizations that we bring together in this very sort of singular moment in time to deliver on this mission, they are challenged by a set of circumstances that is, I think, pretty unique and almost without parallel.
Hmm.
So, you touched on some of these. Yes, there's tremendous complexity. Partly that's a function of scale. Partly I'm based here in New York, so I'm talking to you today from our office in New York City. And if you try and do a mega project in a city as complicated as New York or London, where we've both worked, what you're attempting to do there is to layer something quite literally on top of infrastructure built at sort of various points over the last 150 years, when there would have been a real vision and tremendous skill and commitment to pioneer a new form of transit, but not necessarily a lot of people thinking about what folk might need in 150 years, when they need to look at record keeping and asset management for a new piece of infrastructure that they're laying down. So you've got that complexity in a big city like this. There's the commercial complexity that you talked about, and I think that is a very real thing today, when there's tightness in the supply chains, there's capacity constraints in the marketplace, everything from bonding capacity to craft professional capacity is a constraint. And so owners are searching for, risk transfer models that strike the right balance, I think, between market conditions as they exist today, the reality of a risk that can actually be transferred from one party to another, the need to incentivize performance, but also, I'm very cognizant of the need in those circumstances to demonstrate to stakeholders, funders in particular have this challenge of how they're driving value for taxpayers. And that is a very real and sort of live part of the equation. And then you touched on the technological complexity, and that rang true. I mean, I had a personal experience of this when I was working on the Elizabeth line in London for 3 years. The brain of that subway system is very much the signaling system, and the technologies involved in that, or at least I think that the configuration and the deployment of those technologies, with say a particular version of the rolling stock that's used at the time, or in the case of the Elizabeth line, they were pioneers in platform screen doors, or a ventilation system. Often that configuration and that deployment is of a first of a kind endeavor, and then all the sort of standard things about regulatory complexity and permitting and safety and environmental assessment. So you bundle all of that together, and I think you have a phenomenally challenging, governance and management issue for the project leadership team. And maybe just one final thing, perhaps in sort of terms of framing. That team has been assembled. And when I say team, I mean it encompasses everything: policymakers, funders, designers, contractors, original equipment manufacturers, OEMs, stakeholders that you mentioned in the community. They've somehow got to navigate their way through all of that complexity. And I think you've got to be empathetic to the fact that they may be driven by different incentives or pressures, and we can sort of come back to that maybe in a second. But the critical thing for me is just to recognize that they're all people and organizations who've been thrown together in a boat, very rarely by choice.
Yes.
And they sort of have to figure out like how to row together, like officially,
Yes.
And make this vision a reality. And that's why I think it's hard to think of another parallel in sort of business or politics or the non or profit world that is comparable. The one other dimension of complexity to sort of recognize is clearly that from a psychological perspective, this thing has like a beginning, a middle, and an end. So to sort of state the obvious, it is time, and scope defined. But I think that in and of itself creates another level of challenge as to how to create a high-performing system, in which each person knows their role, how are they contributing, what's expected of them, but also knows that this is, not necessarily an enduring team that they are contributing to, or a culture that they're contributing to. It's an enduring asset that they are contributing to, and that's a very different sort of psychological sort of mindset to have, I think, on a mission like this. I think the other, and it's important because I think it's a bit of an elephant in the room, and we should talk about it openly, is that often, not always, but I think often, a lot of mega projects, they'll generally risk getting off to a pretty difficult start, because the process of actually getting to the starting line, how the project budget was approved, through the procurement process itself for delivering some of the work, probably has, and there's plenty of evidence to document this, cumulative levels of optimism bias in getting to that starting line. Maybe there's been optimism bias in the cost benefit analysis that was probably done, that led to the business case being accepted, with the budget that was proposed in the first place. You see a lot of the time procurement processes that drive optimism. Might be a sort of generous way of describing it, but optimism in the contractors' pricing. And I don't blame the contractors for that, but again, it's a function of the process that's set up. So it means that by the time you actually get to the starting line, and of course, all the different members of the team that we just talked about arrive there at slightly different points. Everyone has different information. They potentially have a very different set of incentives driving their behavior. And so I think often the foundational sort of elements of the mission can be fragile, right? And sort of potentially almost actively hostile to creating a high performing system of delivery. So you have the sort of veneer of the optimism and the enthusiasm at the start of the mission, and everybody feeling sort of quite good about the start line. But like the undercurrent are a set of foundational elements that can risk creating friction
Yes.
downstream. And I think the question, is how quickly can you flesh that out, talk about that openly and put yourself on a pathway where you can, start to align different parties and create that sort of one team, high performing system that I know, you guys specialize in.
Yeah, then I think you kind of got to the heart of the issue, which is with all this complexity, different stakeholders, by necessity, quite often the scopes are divided up, right? So what you have is a set of quote integrated scopes and contracts that are where collaboration is written in as contractual terms in some regards.
Yeah.
Um, but you get to the starting line, maybe some people starting at different times with a project where it feels like you might already be behind. And how do you rapidly mobilize these disparate parties into a high performing team from day one, so to speak?
Yeah.
So, what have you found that's been, successful? By the way, my observation, John, is you guys do this as well as anyone. So, what are some of the things that you found that really accelerate that process? A lot of companies that are just working by themselves would take years to develop some kind of culture like that. How do you pull that together in a major program so quickly?
Um, well, I think probably first of all with a large dollop of like humility, like first and foremost, sort of recognizing that whatever you've got in your toolbox and maybe whatever experience that you've had before, this one will be a little bit different. It will be unique. The all of the complexity factors that you talked about at the beginning, that's partly what makes it unique. And then, the customer may be unique and the stakeholders are unique. So a bit of humility. This is not like, okay, I'm just going to sort of do what I've done previously and then off we go together. Secondly, I think the humility drives to recognizing that you can learn from others.
Yes.
You don't have all of the answers. I think it's interesting to see people in organizations on mega projects, and we do place a large value on this, who are sort of genuinely curious
Hmm.
about the challenge. I mean, I think that as a sort of an attribute is sometimes a little bit overlooked, but I'm a big fan of curiosity, obviously with a purpose, but I think curiosity in another person's sort of position can take you to a space of empathy. And empathy with the environment within which you're operating is a
Yes.
really important part of that equation. Practical example of that. I mean, if you're again, when I was sort of reflecting on my time on the Elizabeth line, or if we're some of the projects that we're involved in today, if we are helping a customer to build an asset in a live operating environment that they've got an existing system, and so you have to be super respectful of the fact that in the sort of hierarchy of things that are keeping them awake at night, making sure that that system is functioning effectively is probably the number one thing.
Hmm.
It's got to function safely and it's got to get, passengers across the network efficiently. And so if you are trying to do work in that environment and you're trying to solicit an outage from the owner, you've got to be super aligned with the operating side of the house. You've got to be very respectful that that an outage in that environment, which is clearly going to impact the operating part of the organization, for whom operations is probably the currency of their business, right? That is the absolute sort of nucleus, the core of their business. You've got to sort of respect it as a privilege to get the outage,
Hmm.
and then you've got to be, I think, both fantastically methodical in the planning of that work upstream. You've got to engage and understand the operator's concern in that environment. You've got to assemble all the parts and the pieces together, and then you've got to utilize that privileged moment in time as efficiently as possible. And so we have learned, I mean, this is like a sort of micro example, but we have learned over time and sort of developed a set of tools, sort of T minus tools we call them, but to really help us plan with the customer that type of work. And we'll plan it down to like 15-minute segments in a 5 or 6 hour window. And what it does lead to, and what it should lead to, is real productivity in those moments, a massive sense of accomplishment and achievement in that moment. Potentially doing a little bit more than you might have anticipated. But what it then breeds is confidence and real trust, which of course is the accelerant, really at the heart of the conversation that we're having today. It creates trust between the various different parties, the operator, the PMC that's sort of providing support to the owner, the contractor or the subcontractor that is doing the work. And in that moment, as you are planning for the execution of that work in that outage, just to pick up one of the points that you were saying, like, I think that the behavior that you exhibit in those moments, of having empathy, having respect for what it is you are trying to attempt within the environment within which the work is going to be prosecuted, but that you're leaving to a degree like the badge at the door. You are trying to truly operate as a one, with a one team mentality. And maybe we could touch on sort of behavior in a second, because I think that is really at the heart of all of this. But that's where I think we try to hold ourselves accountable when we are working with contractors or working with owners. But that place of empathy for the environment within which you're operating is really important. I think a sort of precondition for being successful, with mega projects in live operating environments in particular.
Yeah, John, I heard you reference the one team or one team concept, which seems to be a fairly common term that I've heard of late. Interestingly enough, I had a prospect recently tell me, every project says one team. Very rarely does it actually show up as one team. And I think when you point to things like trust, relationships, one team, things that are perhaps beyond the contract or beyond transactions, what are some of the things that you've found that really accelerate that? Because again, I think a lot of these things don't just happen through purely really competent project management. There are things that require some level of project leadership. So what are some of the, if just practices or things that you've found that have accelerated that?
So I would say, I think like behavior is at the heart of it. I mean, I think when we talk about one team and we use certain terms in relation to the definition of one team, I do sometimes worry that people think there isn't like a sort of hard edge to that, or there isn't a definition to that. I mean, just because we're talking about one team doesn't mean to say that I'm neglectful of your need as a supplier to, get a return on the talent or the investment that you're making. Like there is a hard, if we want to use those terms, there is a hard edge to that. And I think, it's daft not to sort of recognize that and to be sort of fair and reasonable, understand that, that's an aspiration. We're in a mission together, but we've all got sort of different constituent parts of this mission, roles that we're trying to play. But it is perfectly reasonable for us, for example, to be clear about the returns that we're trying to make and to be clear about the roles that individuals have. So when we talk about collaboration, yes, trust is an integral part of that. But I think, within the definition of something like collaboration, which is really about a process as much as it is sort of tonally about how people behave, that, we have to be very clear about, well, what's my role in relation to doing this piece of work? And what is your role in relation to doing this piece of work? So, you can hold yourself accountable for what it is that you said you were going to do, and I'm going to hold myself accountable. So I think that, we shouldn't sort of disguise the idea of or conflate the idea of one team with something that feels like a little bit mushy or a little bit soft or whatever. I think there is a hardness and a preciseness to it, but what it speaks to is a commitment to the mission in the round.
Yeah.
and a commitment to want to be at the table and to sort of exhibit the right behaviors to be successful in that environment. So, we touched on sort of behaviors a couple of times, and the reason why I use that term is because I think sometimes when you talk about sort of culture in a mega project environment, it can, particularly if you're talking with engineering colleagues, it can feel like a little bit abstract.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's sort of hard to really define. So the thing I like about behavior is it can be a little bit more precise, and it can speak to me and what do I need to do to sort of exhibit a set of actions in my relationship with colleagues or my relationship with partners or with owners that will lead to a better outcome. I was involved in something here, Casey, a couple of years ago. So we were celebrating our 125th anniversary as a business. So 127 today. And so we used the 125th anniversary as a bit of a forcing function to ask ourselves some questions about how do we want to behave with each other? And how does that create, a positive working environment, a culture that people can be proud to contribute to and proud to represent to the outside world. And I was involved in an exercise that lasted for about 6 months in a renewal of what we call our vision, values. It was then called covenants, and is now called commitments, or sort of VVNCs. And that exercise involved like thousands of people actually across our business engaging in a conversation about how do we update these? How do we make them relevant? How do we make them sort of purposeful? And every company, I think, will have, or every organization will have maybe a version of this. But we aligned on sort of 5 key things. So one was that we wanted to recognize that we live for a challenge. So really at the heart of that is how do we help make our customers' ambitions a reality? Secondly, that we and this very much speaks to behavior, like we do the right thing. So from an ethical perspective, if there's ever a doubt about like which side of that line you should be on, you always do the right thing in those circumstances. And that is interesting, and an interesting challenge for a company that works across multiple jurisdictions and sort of multiple cultures. The third is that we use these words very deliberately. We had a lot of discussion about it at the time, but we take care of each other. And previously, we had something that talked about the importance of keeping people safe. But the idea of like taking care of each other was, yes, it was about ensuring that people are safe in the field. That is by far the most like important thing that we would do as a business, is to protect people. Every accident is preventable, but it was also speaking to the importance of well-being in a modern, high stress environment, which mega projects often are. Fourthly, we talked about how we succeed together, and that was really a nod to trying to ensure there was a diverse range of views incorporated into our approach. And then we talked about building trust and striving for a one team approach, but also, holding ourselves accountable. And I think, some version of that, as I say, most companies would have, but I think that sort of consciousness from the leadership of a mega project to sort of try and define the behaviors that it wants to see being exhibited on a project is and designing a process to surface those behaviors and get buy-in and alignment around those behaviors, I think is a sort of foundational element of a really strong, effective project. And it's very difficult. I mean, you must have seen this multiple times, right? It's very difficult to carve out time for this at the front end of a project. Recognizing what I said about the environment, everybody getting there at different starting points. I think it's a phenomenally important investment to make that pays dividends 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. But you've got to understand, obviously, the pressures that people are facing to sort of get on and do stuff. But this is a core foundational element for me. And then maybe just one final point on this is, agreeing it, writing it, that's obviously one thing. The real acid test is how has it lived.
Yeah, great, John. I listen. I appreciate in one regards the simplicity you're bringing to the complex projects, which is, one team is not perhaps an absolute of we're all on the exact same team with the same incentives and completely aligned from that perspective, but more of a place to come from and look from, which is, you know, we all succeed. The project doesn't succeed unless we all succeed to some degree, and we're for each other and care. But I really appreciate the simplicity of sometimes simple behaviors. I've heard you say, John, it seems simple but profound, which is, the simple behavior of let's pick up the phone and get out, or come talk to me versus being behind the laptop or sending letters, right?
Yeah.
The simple things like that could make a big difference. I'm just interested in your comments on that because I think sometimes we were over engineer, human factors. So
Yeah.
you know,
It's
any reflection on that?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, look, wherever there's a simpler answer, take the simpler answer. But we're all guilty, aren't we, of trying to find like complexity in stuff. One element of the simpleness is like reverting back to some things that we've done before. And I'm very conscious. As like a 51-year-old, I don't want to sound like you're out of touch and a bit old school. I am self-aware around some of these things, but like technology, I think is obviously a phenomenal way of us. Look, what are we doing today, right? We're having a conversation. We're
Right.
going to be able to sort of broadcast this conversation to a much wider group of people than we could ever do if we had to all sort of physically get in the same space together. But I do think there are times, I think, particularly when you're trying to have difficult conversations. So for me, like working in a collaborative environment, exhibiting good behaviors doesn't mean like having a pass at difficult conversations, right? You still got to have really difficult conversations. But my learning has been that I think the more that I challenge myself to have them in person, the better. And so, I had an example of this quite recently, actually. We have, it was a topic we've been working through for some time. It's a difficult one for us. And we planned a couple of months out, like a series of inputs into a discussion, set of work streams. And so we planned the work effectively. Everybody knew what they were doing. They knew the inputs that they needed to deliver for this piece of work and see if we could try and sort of resolve this challenge. So just sort of did all the right things, but it culminated as having a workshop here in New York, and that involved us bringing sort of various different people globally from around the business to have that conversation. And we'd done something the night before, like was a bit of a very relaxed and informal sort of team building exercise, but actually just getting to know people as people,
Mm-hmm.
which I think we often sort of overlook is a really important part
Right.
of this equation.
Yes.
But people are just people, and they've got their own needs and families, and so I think sort of getting through that professional veneer and trying to sort of understand who they are as folk is really important. But we did make a very we wanted to make a point of having that session in person, and was it a little bit more expensive, and was it a bit more time consuming for people? Yes, of course it was. And we talked about this afterwards. I think the conversation was significantly richer as a result of doing that, and significantly more productive. And so in the end, it was a sort of alignment of those two things, sort of good preparation. We knew we had a problem to solve, good inputs, high quality work, but actually coming together and talking that through with one another made a massive difference. So I think that's particularly important in today's environment, because you actually got to discipline yourself to do it, because it can
Yes.
be a slightly more harder or complicated path logistically, but it's a simpler path in terms of getting to the outcome you probably want to get to.
Yep. Great. John, maybe a little advice. So, as someone who's been projects for a long time, like you have, with large scale complexity, all different kinds of experiences, I imagine, there's project professionals from owner side, perhaps different industries, oil and gas, mining, infrastructure, that might be listening. Any single piece of important advice that you would offer project project professionals from your experience that might be applicable to everyone?
Look, I think we touched on a couple of things. You know, I'm a big fan of exhibiting curiosity. I think that is really important in any environment, and you know, allied to that is the need to stay humble and just to recognize that there's, this is a constant process of learning, and there's a ton of great expertise out there, and if you can find a way of sort of tapping into that, unlocking it, um, we'll all be we'll all be better as a result of it. But I've experienced, particularly in the last few years, like situations which I've just totally taken myself out of the comfort zone. Like I have been doing something and I thought like, okay, I know how this works, and I was sort of in a bit of a groove. And then somebody said to me, okay, well, we want you to go and do something over here that's completely different. Or when I went onto the Elizabeth line, I was thrust into an environment that I felt very uncomfortable with
Yeah.
because I don't have a sort of deep technical skill set in rail, and so I was trying to sort of figure out how could I fit in. But I think for anybody that aspires to be impactful in the world of mega projects, I would say challenging yourself, taking yourself outside of your comfort zone, working in different sectors, potentially in different jurisdictions, different cultures. You learn a huge amount being,
Hmm.
New York looks the same as London in many respects, but of course it's like fantastically different in terms of how it operates. So you grow as a person as a result of that, and feel much more sort of professionally rewarded as a result of making some of those choices and having the confidence to sort of follow through on it. So yeah, I would maybe offer that up as a thought.
Yeah, well, I think that's great, John, because I think, many years ago, I'm not sure that when you described the characteristics of an effective, really high powered project leader, if it was humility and curiosity, right? So I think that certainly reflects, you know, what's perhaps required from human factors to be successful today with such complex relationships and new things emerging. So I think it's great advice, and uh, I'm reminded to take it myself sometimes. So thank you for that.
We all are. We all
So
are.
yeah, John, thanks for joining us for this inaugural episode, and it's just been a pleasure. Not just in this conversation, but working with you and your group. I think you guys have certainly demonstrated everything that you've spoken about. Certainly for me, is not just talk; it's things that I've observed, which is why I wanted to speak with you and share some of your knowledge. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me along. I've enjoyed today's conversation, and maybe just quickly. It goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier, which is as much as I think we may know and the experience that we've got. I've always learned something from our engagements with you guys. I think you definitely bring something unique and special to the party, and I commend you, for that, and look forward to working with you in the future.
Great, thanks, John.
Thank you.